Very happy to have Paul-Konstantin Oehlmann here to give a talk about some strongly coupled theories in elliptic fourfolds. So take it away, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. And yeah, let me start by thanking the organizers, and especially you, John and Cody, for putting together this nice conference and to keep it going throughout all this time, and also, of course, to present my work, which is non-flat elliptic fourfolds and threeform cohomology and 4D strongly coupled theories. And it's based on this paper, which came out 2 months ago with the same title. And the focus of this paper are essentially certain cohomology contributions of specific Calabi-Yau fourfolds. So let me start with the Hodge diamond of a Calabi-Yau fourfold. And such a Hodge diamond, of course, admits familiar contributions that you also know from a Calabi-Yau threefold, namely the scalar moduli and the complex structure moduli that you have here. But as opposed to a Calabi-Yau threefold, there's also a new contribution, namely this H21, this threeform cohomology, which is neither scalar nor complex structure. So this is really a new contribution. H22 is actually not an independent one. And one of the nice features about this additional contribution is, when you, for example, consider mirror symmetry, is that complex structure and scalar moduli are still mapped onto each other, and this threeform cohomology is mapped onto itself. So this alone tells you that this is something that deserves some attention. So this is my first motivation into all of this. Then, of course, if you consider M and F theory, where these Calabi-Yau fourfolds are most prominently used, you wonder how does these threeform cohomologies actually contribute as states physically in these theories. So if you start in 3D and you put M theory on such a smooth Calabi-Yau fourfold that has H21 forms, then you expand the M theory threeform, and you will find that it, as you can just see, it will add additional chiral singlets with the amount of this threeform cohomology. So then, if your Calabi-Yau fourfold is also elliptically fibered, you can lift this whole thing to 4D, and there you have to essentially split up the contribution of your threeforms into a base contribution and a fiber contribution. And the base contribution will actually dualize to 4D Riemann nuance, and the fiber contribution will actually stay a chiral singlet. So these, especially those ones, are the ones that I will focus on, because it has been shown, some work by Grimm and Taylor, 2012, that these specific fiber contributions mix with the scalar moduli of your base, and they admit very, very specific and special shift symmetries. And again, all these features tell you that these H21 contributions are some that deserve special attention. And of course, as someone who does a lot of F theory like me, you would like to know, how can I actually systematically engineer these H21 contributions geometrically? And the spoiler to all of this is going to be that this will have to do with certain compactifications of some 60 SCFT sectors in your geometry. So to tell you something about these 60 SCFT sectors, I will first have to go to Calabi-Yau threefolds, especially elliptic Calabi-Yau threefolds. So I will show you a lot of pictures like those, where I have a Calabi-Yau threefold, which I can split up into a base part, which you see below, and the fiber part that you have here. So this is elliptically fibered. So at a generic point, you have an elliptic fiber here, a torus. And I now also want to add some singularities, maybe 2 singularities that have some ADE type, G1 and G2. And these 2 singularities, they have a crescent resolution. And that means that I can resolve them, and the resolution picture will look like some ADE Duncan diagram like this. But then you can also allow for intersections of these 2 singularities, and you can actually allow to have them intersect into something which has not such a group structure like here. And this is called a non-minimal singularity. And these non-minimal singularities are essentially associated to the 60 SCFTs that you have maybe heard about before. Great. So if I have now such a non-minimal singularity, usually your you're in big trouble if you want to consider a smooth Calabi-Yau threefold. But there's now two crepant ways to resolve your Calabi-Yau threefold. So there's two ways to resolve your Calabi-Yau, even though it has such a non-minimal fiber singularity, in a smooth way such that you preserve the Calabi-Yau condition. The first, and this is the older way of doing so, is essentially by removing the intersection point, by blowing up the intersection point in the base. And doing so, you generically have to do that like t times until the fiber is fully regular, and then you might also be left up with some kind of fiber singularities that you also need to resolve, and maybe you have to add additional R fiber divisors here. And this amount of t times that you're having is essentially the dimension of the tensor branch of your 6D SCFT. If you put this whole theory on a circle, of course, these t and r additional resolution divisors is then describing precisely the dimension of the 5-dimensional Coulomb branch. So the number of all these base and fiber resolutions that you have of this non-minimal singularity is giving you, or is coinciding with the 5D Coulomb branch of this circle reduced theory. So this is the first way of resolving it, but I also want to consider the second way, and actually I want to mainly consider the second way. And this is a so-called non-flat resolution, which have been observed, for example, here by Sakura and Craig a couple of years ago, that many of these, or basically all of these non-minimal singularities in the fiber, you can also resolve by essentially stuffing these resolution divisors into the fiber. And you will have a surface component EI here that is of complex dimension 2. So this is very important because as opposed to these ADE fibers here that have complex dimension 1, so they are just some reduced torus, this surface component EI here is of complex dimension 2, and that's why we call it a non-flat fiber, because here the dimension of the fiber jumps. And I can essentially take all these blow-ups that I have and stuff all the things into my fiber, and I have a collection of surfaces now, and I can do it completely until I end up with my smooth intersection point, and I have resolved my non-minimal singularity with a bunch of these surface components. The important takeaway here is that it requires exactly the same amount of surface components to resolve the singularity in a non-flat way than the amount of singularities that I had to blow up the base and then the regular fiber singularities. And this is, of course, consistent with the 5D M-theory duality of these 6D SCFT compactifications that also has been looked at a lot in the recent literature. So again, this is the takeaway that you're having here. You have a non-minimal fiber singularity, and I have these two different phases. I have a resolution phase where I blow up the base and I keep the fiber flat, or I have a different phase where I can blow up my fiber in a non-flat way, but I keep my base unchanged. And the interpretation is that these two different resolutions are just part of the extended Kähler cone of the Calabi-Yau threefold. And for that reason, they have to have the same dimension of resolutions. So especially this last option to resolve my singularity in a non-flat way gives me the possibility to take a smooth Calabi-Yau n-fold, and I'm not forced to really do something with my base. So I can do it for any base. I don't have to resolve my base, really. I just have to do something really nasty to my fiber. But that's what I choose to do. And this is, of course, the perspective that I'm choosing to take when I'm considering a Calabi-Yau fourfold. So now I really take exactly the same configuration. I take my non-flat Calabi-Yau threefold, where the non-flatness happens in a point of the base, and I extend my base to complex 3 dimensions, and therefore I get a Calabi-Yau fourfold. So essentially, I just extend my base by 1 complex dimension, and that immediately tells you that the surface components of my fiber that were here sitting over a point in my complex 2-dimensional base will now sit over a complex one-dimensional object, which is a Riemann surface. And this Riemann surface generically has a genus, and I call this genus G alpha. It could also be multiple Riemann surfaces that I index with this index alpha here. So the nice thing here is that this whole resolution process is really independent of if it sits over a base or a Riemann surface. So the amount of resolution surfaces EI has not really changed at all, depending on the non-minimal singularity I started with. So this amount of surfaces EI that I have over one of these Riemann surfaces here is the same as in the 60 picture. And this is actually, for experts, this is the same way how you can think how you extend the base from a K3, from an elliptic K3 to an elliptic Calabi threefold. So this whole structure here now gives rise to a divisor that itself inherits this whole fibration structure. So these surfaces here are now, of course, the fiber over this divisor D with a base, the Riemann surface. And this fibration structure that I'm having is really nice because it allows me to compute the cohomology of this divisor here that I'm getting generically. And I can compute this via the Leray-Hirsch spectral sequence, which essentially tells you that I can just get the cohomology of my divisor from the cohomology contributions of my constituents, of my base Riemann surface and of my Riemann fiber surface EI. The important thing here is that generically you will always get a divisor that has a non-trivial one-form cohomology, which is given by the genus of this curve. So for each of these EI fiber components, I will get a divisor with a one-form cohomology, which is given by the genus it is fibered over. Okay, this is of course just the cohomology of the divisor. Now I have to embed this divisor somehow into my Calabi fourfold. This you can do via the so-called Gaussian map, J. And then via the Gaussian complex, you can compute this cohomology contributions of the divisor and how it injects into cohomology contributions of your fourfold, X4. And you see that H0 embeds and becomes a Kähler moduli in your fourfold, and the one-form cohomology just becomes the three-form cohomology of a Calabi fourfold. And this is, of course, something that Sebastian Grein and Thomas Grimm did 2017, which is also based on this math work in the toric context by Maviotov. Great. So now remember that the resolution process is of the non-minimal singularity in the surface. I mean, of these surface components is independent if I do it on a Riemann surface. So now for each curve alpha, I simply sum over my 60 data, which is the Coulomb branch, and I can simply write down the whole cohomology contributions in terms of the 60 data. So each non-minimal singularity, which is fibered over some Riemann surface, which is a codimension 2 object, will inject these cohomology contributions, which is, well, linear in terms of its Coulomb branch, in view of the 5D theory, and the genus it is fibered over. And I should, of course, say that this contribution here is not a contribution that depends on the base. So these are precisely the H21 contributions to the fourfold that come from the fiber, and therefore will contribute this additional singlets I talked about in the beginning. Excellent. So you can do a lot of things, and I considered a couple of examples in the paper that you can where you can double check all these general considerations in view of the biderivative construction. You can, for example, easily get some geometries where you have an E-string theory, which is like the simplest kind of 60 SCFT, which is compactified on a Riemann surface of G153, so really large. But you also can easily engineer higher non-trivial compactifications like E8 SUN superconformal matter, where n is 1, 2, or 3, which also sits over Riemann surfaces of relatively high genus. So this all works. You can cross-check it. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk now is I want to consider a certain type of conifold transition that removes those codimension 2 non-flat fibers from your Calabi-Yau fourfold. And we will see that the first kind of removal is going to be like a little bit like a Higgs branch type of transition. So it will be a complex structure deformation. And the second type of transition is going to be a Coulomb branch type of transition. So this will be like a blow up of the base that I will use in order to remove this. And we will give a short discussion of the physics of this. Of course, before I start, I want to give a really quick disclaimer. First, everything I will say is going to be in a compact Calabi-Yau fourfold. So gravity will be there in the 4D F theory interpretation of this. And I will only look at the geometry. So I will not look at G4 flux. I will just look at the geometry here. And but of course, I will have a little bit more to say on this at the end. Okay, so the conifold transition I want to look at is some that I can really take very, very analogous to a 60 example. So what I want to start with is a 60 F-theory compactification via an elliptic Calabi-Yau threefold, which has this specific gauge group, E6 times E1, and an E string. So here, there's a specific intersection locus where the fiber becomes non-flat, and it is just an E string, so it has just one of these non-flat surfaces that you can see here. Okay, so the first phase that I want to consider is the one where you blow up the base and remove this intersection, and you get a regular fiber here. You can do this. This will not change the Hodge numbers since it sits in the extended scalar cone, just what I said before. So this is the first phase that you can have, and this is like tensor branch of this theory. Great. The second perspective, or the second phase I want to look at, is actually a deformation of this E string. It's a very specific one. It's a deformation where I keep my E6 times U1 gauge symmetry, but I deform via complex structure deformation this intersection point with the E string in such a way that it spits out essentially a 27 representation with this U1 charge and a singlet hypermultiplet. So essentially I break up the E string. Yeah.
Quick question, is this really an E6 cross U1 mod Z3 global structure group?
Oh yeah, that's right. That's correct. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, good question. And so this is, yeah, precisely. So this is what you have. And actually the 60 anomalies that you're having that you can compute on very general grounds tell you that this is the only way how you can deform such an E string. So the only way how you can in 60 deform this E string curve that you had before, or this E string point, is via splitting it up into a 27 with and a singlet with these U1 charges. Okay, this is what we do in 60. Now we do the same thing in 4D. So that means that we now have an E string that sits not only on a point, but on some Riemann surface of some higher genus. And here, in the example I consider also in the paper, it's a Riemann surface of genus 5. So that's just something that you get by the choice of the base. So now we take our first phase. And the first phase is, again, to deform this E string curve. And the deformation is precisely the same as before. We will deform it into a 27 curve and a singlet curve. Yeah? Remember that these are now curves because we're now in a fourfold. You can, of course, compute the cohomology change, and the cohomology change is exactly as expected. Yeah? You will lose one scalar moduli from the non-flat surface, and the associated H21 forms because the non-flat surface is not over this genus 5 surface here anymore. Great. So, but now what you actually find, and this is, again, there's a way more general story to it, is that these 27 plet and singlet plet curve actually re-intersect. And they don't intersect in codimension 2, but in codimension 3, because now I have a fourfold. I have more complex dimension at my disposal. And now you will find that essentially there's enough room that these two guys will again intersect in some kind of E string intersection, but in codimension 3. So these codimension 3 singularities generically have an F-theory interpretation or a type 2B interpretation in terms of superpotential couplings. But how can we see that? So the way to see this best is by deforming the whole geometry a tiny little bit more and by breaking the U1. Okay, so now I go a step further and really break gauge symmetry. By breaking the gauge symmetry, I only have the 27 curve left of my E6, and there the very same locus becomes regular and actually becomes one of these infamous E8 Yukawa kind of points that you're having here. And for this, there's actually, of course, vastly researched interpretation for this. And these points are Yukawa couplings of this, or Yukawa self-couplings of this 27. So this would be a 27 cubed coupling. So there's a well-defined interpretation for this. I should, of course, mention that the fiber is not necessarily really of E8 type, but this is what you have. Now, when I'm adding the U1 again, you should also notice that that this is really similar to the 60 case by adding a U1 to an E8. And this will, of course, over-enhance the E8 in 60 to an E string point. And now we have something very similar, but at codimension 3. So now, by adding this U1 again, I will over-enhance the singularity. And of course, the same coupling, the 27 triplet coupling here, is not going to be gauge invariant anymore, because now my 27 plates have a charge. But you should remember that there is, of course, the singlet curve with charge 1, which also intersects the curve. And if I add this one to the coupling, then it is gauge invariant. But it's not a 3-point coupling, but a 4-point coupling. And so this is, of course, all consistent. And these models, and actually exactly this model has been considered in this work, and where it was analyzed that these specific codimension 3 couplings are generated by D1 string instantons. Okay, so to leave you with this, what we have here is that these codimension 3 singularities that you're having here, you can really kind of interpret as a remnant of this deformed E string curve. And it's a remnant because it's representations that are spit out of the codimension 2 E string compactification. And there's still this kind of leftover in terms of this coupling here. Okay, so finally, there was the second phase. So I still have to get rid of this non-flat fiber in terms of base blowups. And the way I can do it is I can consecutively blow up my base. And the first thing I have to do is I have to essentially blow up and split up this genus 5 curve. And by these blowups, this genus 5 curve will be put apart into 6 genus 0 curves, and then I can further blow up those guys. And what you can find when you do all this, consistent with the general considerations, is that you essentially switch around all your Hodge numbers. So by blowing up the base, you will get a lot of additional Kähler moduli. You will lose your H21 threeforms because these are genus 0 curves, and you also get rid of those. And this will also come at the cost of some complex structures. The curious point about all of this, and like I said, there's a more general story to it, and this is satisfied in many, many more examples, is that this change in the Hodge numbers is precisely such that the overall Euler number, which is this linear combination of the 3 Hodge numbers, stays invariant. So I can perform such a base change by not keeping the Hodge numbers invariant, but I can at least keep the Euler number invariant. And this is actually very, very important because now we are coming to the flux. If I do such a physical transition, then I need to keep this D3 tadpole cancellation satisfied, which means that now, since the Euler number doesn't change, I can, for example, more easily satisfy this condition here by, for example, keeping the number of D3 branes and the number of the flux self-integral here unchanged. Great. So this already brings me to my conclusion. So what do we have? We have non-flat fibers in codimension 2. I hoped I could convince you that this is just a very nice way of resolving a Calabi-Yau threefolds with such non-minimal singularities, and I can use them without changing the base. But I simply need to sacrifice the equidimensionality of my elliptic fiber, so something has to go. And the way in a Calabi-Yau fourfold I can view these guys is really just as a compactification of some 6-dimensional conformal matter on some Riemann surface. And these guys generically will contribute to the Kähler moduli, but in particular also to the threeform cohomology. And the contribution is simply given by the genus of the Riemann surface of it is compactified on, and the dimension of the Coulomb branch, which you can get from the 6D data. These fibers you can remove by 2 types of transitions that I've discussed. First, some kind of Higgs branch type of deformation, which essentially pushes the non-flatness from codimension 2 to codimension 3 to points in your base. And these points are generically related to 4-point couplings of the leftovers of some E-string theory that I started with. And I can consider Coulomb branch type of transitions. So I can blow up my base and remove the non-flat fiber in this way. And this will virtually change all the Hodge numbers, in particular these H21 fiber. But the curious fact is that it keeps the Euler number invariant, which is, of course, going to be important if you consider really the G4 flux contribution, which, of course, brings me to my outlook. So G4 flux. This is the next thing to consider in these transitions. And of course, it would be very nice to use that I can start with a flat configuration where I can switch on such a flux and then maybe go back to this codimension 2 point. But then something which you can also do is you can start to look at non-flat fibrations with additional monodromies. So maybe there is an additional monodromy locus that starts to fold these surface components. This is something that would be interesting to look at, such as also transitions of certain higher rank theories. So the transitions that I have looked at here is really just that of the simplest SCFT, the E-string, but I guess we can also easily enhance this to higher, more non-trivial examples that I looked at in my paper. Okay, and with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Paul, for the very nice talk. Let us first, before we, so if you have a question, please type it in the chat. I have a question. Let us thank Paul with our emojis. Seems like Yinan is the first question.
Hi, I just have 2 questions. First is a comment. So you mentioned these Coulomb branch type transitions by blowing up the base. I thought, so for the N-1, there's no Coulomb branch. I thought this is more like some kind of tensor branch type thing, where the tensor field is a dual of the scalar. Yeah,
this is maybe this is the better way of viewing this. That's true. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good comment indeed. Yeah.
And also, so is there anything special about the genus 5 curve in your case, or you can just take any genus, doesn't matter?
No, it doesn't really. Yeah, no, it does not really matter. I mean, you can easily set up a lot of examples where these things happen over any genus curve. There's really nothing special if you go high. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But then why you take genus 5? Is it just?
Oh, that was just for the sake of the example here.
Oh,
I wanted. Okay. Yeah. So, and if you then, I mean, I took it as an example because you need. I mean, I could take genus 0, but it's in order to get the 3 forms that would be boring, and I wanted to show, of course, that if you do that transition when you change the base, then the first thing that you generically have to do is you blow it up, and in this way you split up the genus of this non-flat curve, and then they have genus 0s, and those you can individually blow up again and get rid of. Okay.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, thanks.
Great. And Ling?
Hey, Paul.
Hi, Ling.
Thanks for the talk. Interesting stuff. So I have actually two questions. Maybe the first one relating to your motivation is, does it mean that the H21 type of complex structure deformations, would you expect them always to be of this type? And related, maybe more concretely to the slide, what exactly is the 4D interpretation of the Higgs branch? So really, you are deforming a strongly coupled 4D sector,
Yeah,
in such a way that somehow the remnant is just a quartic Yukawa coupling.
yeah, quite. So I would the exact. Okay, let me first come to the second question. So the exact deformation is that I take is super analogous to the thing in 60. So yeah, I do a specific kind of transition where I have the E string in 60, and then I deform it in such a way that that it spits out these two perturbative sectors here. And then I just do exactly the same thing, but fibering over, say, another P1, or doing it in a fourfold, essentially. So, or let's say it the other way around, the way how you can view it is I engineer this E string by tuning these, the singlet and the 27 on top of each other, and then it over enhances. And so
right,
this
but,
is the,
but I guess my question is, in 4D, does that kind of over enhancement in codimension 2 also has an interpretation of a strongly coupled sector?
Yeah, that's precisely the motivation that I want to take, because it is essentially it's essentially, well, it's a codimension 2 object. So from the 6D perspective, this is like an E string, but now this E string is essentially fibered over some Riemann surface, and I would take the interpretation that this is the compactification of an E string theory on that Riemann surface that I'm then breaking up in this.
So would you expect it to be a n=2 sector?
You mean in 4D?
4D.
Well, I would say it's n=1 because it's not a torus.
Oh, right. Yes. Very good. Yes, of course. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. Good.
Yeah. And then just to follow really quick up. So then really the thing that you naturally find when you analyze these models in detail is that although now you have split up the curve into these two perturbative representations, they will always re-intersect, but one codimension lower in these non-perturbative 4-point couplings. In these Yukawa points.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Good.
Great. Thanks a lot for your very nice talk, Paul. Let us thank Paul again